Let's review results from the On-Farm Network soybean inoculant trials. We've now been investigating soybean inoculant on-farm for 10 years. The question is, with more soybean history in Manitoba, have we built up populations in the soil of the rhizobia species, Bradyrhizobium japonicum, that colonizes soybean root nodules and is responsible for our nitrogen fixation? In terms of Bradyrhizobia persistence in the soil, it survives Manitoba winters well, and the population does decline in a predictable fashion with time since soybeans were last grown. But the interesting piece is that rate of decline is related to soybean history, and that's going to be a theme throughout this talk. At sites in Carmen and St. Adolphe, where soybeans had been grown before, the decline of rhizobia over the years is pretty slow. If we compare that to Melita, a site that hadn't seen soybeans before, the decline over the years is much more rapid of that Bradyrhizobium species. So in the On-Farm Network, we have two trial types that have been investigating inoculation strategies. So the first is comparing a double inoculation strategy to a single inoculation. And then the second compares a single inoculation strategy to no inoculant at all. The choice between these two trial types is dictated by the soybean history in a given field. As the number of soybean crops grown increases, can we reduce our input costs in terms of inoculant? First, we're going to review the double versus single inoculation trials. So the goal of these trials is to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of a seed-applied inoculant alone, or a single inoculation strategy, versus a double inoculation strategy, and that's combining a seed-applied inoculant with an inoculant in furrow. So we're investigating that question of, can we reduce the amount of inoculant we put down as we build up this population of Bradyrhizobia in our soils? Ultimately, will we see a nodulation or a yield response to that extra cost of an in-furrow inoculant? Over the last 10 years, there have been 49 trials comparing a single and double inoculation strategy across Manitoba. So from 2013 to 2015, these trials mostly occurred in central Manitoba, and then in 2018, they expanded to western Manitoba as more soybean history was built up in those western fields. Before participating in these trials, though, a field must have seen at least 2 previous soybean crops, with the last crop occurring sometime in the last 4 years. As some background information on these trials, most of the trials have compared a liquid on seed inoculant to a liquid on seed plus granular in furrow. And then most of the trials have used optimized, nodulator, or cell tech, with a handful testing other inoculant products available. So there are 2 important factors to keep in mind as we review these results. The first is how many previous soybean crops have been in that field, and how many years has it been since the last soybean crop. So for these double versus single trials, most trials have seen 2 previous soybean crops, while about a third have had more soybean history, and then 86% of them have had a soybean crop within the last 3 years. Average seeding rates were around 190,000 seeds per acre, with early season plant stand counts of about 150,000 plants per acre. And about 2/3 of these trials happened on narrow rows, with a third on wider rows. In these trials, we evaluate nodulation at flowering, most often at R1, and we're counting the number of pink nodules. The pink color indicates that they're actively fixing nitrogen. So plants are rated from 0 to 4 based on the number of nodules per plant. So across all 49 trials, nodulation ratings at flowering have been similar between treatments at 96% of the trials. Most of the time, nodulation has been similar between a double inoculant strategy and a single inoculation strategy. What did that mean for yield, though? For this graph on the bottom, each set of paired bars represents an on-farm trial, with the bar on the left, the lighter color, representing the average yield of the single inoculation strips. The bar on the right, the darker colored bar, that's representing the average yield from the double inoculation strips. And then the number above the paired bars, that's the yield difference between a double and a single inoculation treatment on average for that trial. So there have been 3 statistically significant yield responses where yield was improved with the double inoculation strategy over the single inoculant. So that was about 6% of the time. Those are the trials highlighted in green, and the yield difference is highlighted in bold. At that first trial, the last soybean crop was 4 years ago, and it had only had 2 previous soybean crops before that. When we were taking nodulation ratings, we did see a nodulation improvement with the double inoculation strategy. At the second trial, we didn't see the same kind of clues that might result in a yield response. The field had recently seen soybeans, it also had more history, and the nodulation scores were similar between treatments. And then at the third trial, again, it had a longer time since soybeans were in that field and of 2 previous soybean crops. However, those 2 factors didn't translate to a yield difference in nodulation scores between treatments. So the most common factors among the 3 trials that did respond to double inoculation strategies is that there had been only 2 previous soybean crops and that the last one was 4 years ago, so a longer break. Economically, if we say granular inoculant is roughly $10 an acre and liquid is about $3, then we need to see a consistent yield increase of about 0.8 bushels per acre to pay for the extra inoculant if soybeans are selling for 12 bucks a bushel. So when trials were significant, the increase in yield did more than pay for the cost of the granular inoculant, but 94% of the time, we didn't see a yield response, and it cost an extra $10 an acre in extra inputs in those fields. So if moving to a single inoculation strategy is something you're curious in, we do have a checklist for moving to that strategy based on your field history. So we want to see 2 previous well-nodulated soybean crops, and one of those crops, last crops occurring in the last 4 years. There's also this question or note about significant drought or flooding occurring in that field. So we do have some research indicating that these rhizobia will survive some flooding. And this on-farm research data set has also captured quite a few dry seasons, and we're still not seeing a response to that double inoculation strategy. So it's worth revisiting this 4th bullet, considering your field conditions, how challenging have they been? But if this is something that you're curious about, we can absolutely run an on-farm trial before committing to this on every acre on your farm. So the other soybean inoculation strategy we've investigated over the last 7 years has been a single inoculation strategy versus no inoculant at all on fields with more history of soybeans. In the single versus none trials, we're aiming to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of a seed-applied inoculant alone versus no inoculant at all in soybean fields. So with more soybean history, do we even need to inoculate at all? That's the question. Over the last 7 years, 38 trials have compared a single inoculation strategy to none, largely occurring in central and eastern Manitoba. So to participate in these trials, fields required a minimum of at least 3 previous soybean crops, and again, soybeans within the last 4 years of the rotation. So some background information on this trial type. Most of these trials have evaluated a liquid on seed versus none, with about 10% of the trials looking at a peat on seed as the single. So most commonly, products used have been Optimize, Nodulator, and Celtec, with some others mixed in. So fields in these trials have had more history than in the double inoculation trials, with 75% of trials having seen more than 4 soybean crops in its previous history, and most often the last soybean crop in these fields have been in the last 3 years. On average, seeding rates above 200,000 plants per acre were used in these trials, with early season plant stands of about 160,000 plants per acre is what we were recording when we went in for data collection, and then 50-50 on if these trials have used narrow or wide rows. So we evaluate nodulation the same way we do in double inoculation trials by counting the nodules at flowering. Here, nodulation ratings have been similar between single inoculant strips and those without inoculant 95% of the time. And then when we're looking at yield results from these trials, everything on this graph is in muted colors because there has not been a statistically significant yield response to a single inoculant strategy in any of these trials. No inoculant has performed the same as a seed-applied inoculant in every trial we've done. So these fields have a naturalized population of Bradyrhizobium japonicum, and they are effectively colonizing root nodules, fixing nitrogen in these untreated strips. In terms of economics, assuming a cost of $3 an acre for liquid on seed application, we'd need to see a pretty small yield response of about 1/4 of a bushel per acre to pay for that inoculant. So we haven't seen it pay for itself yet, But you could also look at this as a cheap insurance strategy to avoid a nodulation failure in some of those years that have more challenging conditions, because that nodulation failure is going to be a much more costly recovery. But the data shows that we really don't need it when we have the history. So do we have a comprehensive strategy for these more experienced soybean fields? Well, we can tell that these fields have built up the Japonicum populations. The question remains, though, on if these populations, as they're surviving in the soil and reproducing with native bacteria, will they remain effective at fixing nitrogen? Will they continue to be effective at forming nodules with soybeans long term as well? Or are they going to put more resources into surviving in the soil, lose some of that ability? So answers to those questions will impact inoculation strategies long term. So we have questions on if we should inoculate maybe on a rotational basis, or maybe only in the challenging years. There's lots more to learn here, and we do have research ongoing looking into these things. So in the States, University of Nebraska-Lincoln has a decision worksheet for experienced soybean fields to help walk through this decision too. So if you read through their questions here, you can see that this would need some made in Manitoba adjustments to be applicable here, but maybe this is something we can develop in the future too. Considering that number of soybean crops, also how long since the last crop, and if there were any challenges in that field over the last few years that might be impacting the survivability of soil rhizobia. So that would be a really nice tool, or even the ability to quantify Rhizobia japonicum in the soil ahead of planting soybeans. Help us make some of those decisions. So more research needed here, and some ground truthing if we were to develop a inoculant checklist like this. But what I would recommend, though, is to assess nodulation in every soybean field every year. Soybeans need a minimum of 10 nodules per plant to achieve 90% of maximum yield. So assessing nodulation at flowering can help inform management decisions ahead of pod fill when soybeans are starting to draw on a lot of nitrogen. So looking at it at flowering, that's going to give you the lead time to assess if a rescue application might be necessary in soybeans if you're not seeing those 10 nodules. So the number of nodules you're finding also can feed into your future inoculant decisions and management on that field as well. And then also just a reminder that fields best suited to soybeans have less than 50 pounds per acre of residual nitrogen to promote nodule growth and development. So when N starts to get higher, soybeans start to get lazy. They start to feed off of soil N instead of spending the energy to create nodules that are ultimately going to carry them through pod fill. So if you're interested in learning more about these trials or conducting a trial on your farm, reach out to Ian, the On-Farm Network technical specialist. And all of our trial results can be found in the results database by following this QR code or by visiting manitobapulse.ca. You'll end up with this database kind of on the right, where you can filter by crop type, trial type, and there is a searchable map as well. So thanks for listening. I've been Laura, Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers Agronomist. So you can also stay up to date on some of this information and the latest research information by following us on social media.